afternoon and welcome to our Leadership and Change series. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming former Speaker of the House, Chris Benge. He came in from Tulsa to visit with us today, and we're really excited to have him. For those of you that are in the class, there is a sign-up sheet going around. Make sure that you've signed up. Next week, President Betts will be back and will be facilitating next week's class. So I am sure with his travels that he's had.
This is Broken Arrow. Are you all sending sound yet?
If you can't hear us, then no.
Do you have a mic?
Yeah, you may need to
Oh.
Yeah.
Here.
You don't even have to hold it. Yes. One that works. Let me, should we stay on? Okay.
All right, for those of you that are in the class, make sure you sign in. Next week, President Betts will be back, and I'm sure with all of his travels, he will be full of insight and information, and I'm sure it'll be a class you won't want to miss. As of today, we've got, as I said, former Speaker of the House, Chris Benge. We're going to open up with a video that President Betts recorded before he left, introducing Chris, and then Chris will take the floor and share some thoughts and comments, and then we will do question and answers. I've asked Jerry Cook, where are you, Mr. Cook? Mr. Cook will join Chris at the front of the room and help facilitate our session with him today. So with that being said, I'd like to turn it over to our screen for President Betts.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to NSU's Leadership and Change Forum. I'm very pleased to help introduce today a special friend of Northeastern State University and Oklahoma higher education, someone who should be very well known to you. Our guest today is the former Speaker of the Oklahoma House of Representatives, Chris Benge. Chris comes to us with an incredible background and with an ability to understand the issues that face higher education as we try to build Oklahoma's future. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, our friend, Speaker of the House of Representatives, Chris Benge. Chris?
Thank you. Can everyone hear? Okay. No one had to turn it on. How about now? A little better? There we go. I hear it now. That's good. Well, thanks. And, I appreciate the nice invitation, or the invitation from Mr. Cook and President Betts. And I hated that President Betts is not able to be here, so I could have interaction with him. I've gotten to know him over the last few years, and really enjoy his ability to engage and engage in thought and dialogue. I wish I could be here for when he comes back. I mean, it sounds like the trip that he's taking is so timely, and so I'm sure it would be very interesting to hear his report because of the area of being such a center of attention today, and fascinating to me, I guess, from a observation of an American, just the amount of change that we're seeing around the world. I mean, you all are in a time right now, I hope you realize that there are some major shifts going on, worldwide, nationwide, even right on down to the state and this municipal level. And so many signs of that, not only the things that you see going on in the Middle East, but you see the discussions in Washington are of a different tone. Nowadays, the discussions at the state and municipal level are very different, and a lot of it has to do with, well, a big part of it has to do with the financial conditions of the world, the financial conditions of governments around the world. It almost seems to me that there are very few that are exempt from having to really analyze their situation today. And what that's doing, that's creating, I think, a lot of the anxiety that you see. And that's why I think it's so interesting to see the Middle East and what's changing over there. And I think all of us are kind of watching and waiting and hoping that what follows will be good. We're all, I think, very big promoters, of course, as Americans. We're big promoters of democracy and open government, but not knowing, knowing that when you have a change in a government like that, you create a void or vacuum. Somebody fills that, and who's going to step up and fill that? Who's going to step up and be a leader? I guess if we can apply it to what we're talking about today, will be interesting to see. I had an opportunity, in fact, about 2 weeks ago, to visit with a delegation from Iraq that had come over to talk to different levels of government in America about transparency in government, and had a really good conversation with this Iraqi delegation, and felt like, personally felt like that I was being a part of something kind of big, because Iraq, of course, as Middle Eastern countries go, is on the cutting edge of trying to create an open and free government, and to be able to be in a part of that discussion and maybe give some advice or something that might help in that regard was a really great experience. And so there's just a tremendous amount of movement going on in the world, to me, that's worth watching. And I hope all of you here are, and I assume if you've signed up for a leadership class, that you are people who follow issues closely, so you kind of know what's going on. If you don't, I would surely encourage you to do so, because things are changing really quickly right now, and I would almost put it in the level, not Dr. Cook. I started to call you Dr. Cook. Did I promote you or demote you?
Thank you. How about Vice President or something?
Vice President, okay.
Just Jerry.
Okay, Jerry. I started to say it almost qualifies as a quantum leap. Maybe not quite, but it's big. I mean, I really do think it's big. And so this is a good discussion, and I guess what got me off on that is I wish I could be here for President Betts when he comes back and reports on his travels. Give you a little bit of my background. Of course, you've gotten the background of my legislative experience. Previous to 1998, when I was elected, and of course we have 12-year term limits in the House, or in the state legislature, so I had to leave last November because of term limits. And but previous to that, I had worked in mainly in a small family-owned business that my dad actually still has. It's a small construction and painting business. And so I came up in a small business atmosphere, working around the trades, blue collar, very blue collar. My family's very blue collar, and had a few family members who have gone and got their degree, but most of my family's very blue collar. Grew up in Southwest Tulsa, and I live in Berry Hill, which is just west of Tulsa. So, but previous to getting elected, that was kind of my career, until I had an opportunity to run for office, and did, and was elected, and felt like the proverbial dog that caught the car. You've heard about the dog that was chasing the car and finally caught the car, and he really didn't know what to do with it. That was kind of almost the feeling I had, because I had no previous political experience, and I was not a part of any kind of an establishment, if you will, politically. I just had a desire to represent the area that I grew up in, and went out and told the voters what I wanted to do, and I guess they accepted that and believed me and put me in office. I say all that to say, I think that if there's a moral of that story, is that this system that we have of government in the United States, and I know that so many people complain about it, and there's plenty to complain about. I mean, there's a lot of things that people don't like about what's going on, but I think our system, I'm a defender of our system of government, because I do think that it is, in spite of some flaws you may see, you do have an opportunity for so-called citizen representatives to be a part of the process, at least at the state level, and I think it applies at the federal level as well, that people from different backgrounds can come and serve and represent the people in our government. And I like to use my example because I think I was the most unlikely person to probably ever hold political office, at least in my mind. I'm sure there are others who have similar backgrounds. But not really I didn't grow up saying I want to be in office, and so it just happened. Opportunities came about and took those opportunities and was elected in '98. And I can tell you when I was elected, I didn't say immediately that I wanted to be Speaker of the House either. In fact, probably my first 3 or 4 years in office, when I was in the legislature, I remember many times thinking, I would never want that job. I would never want to be the Speaker of the House, because I would see the previous speakers and the situations that you come under as a leader, if you will, of a big body of people who have so many different viewpoints, you know. In its very simple and most elementary form, the state legislature represents, it is a microcosm of 3.6 million people. And when you think about it that way, and think about how hard it would be for 3.6 million people to ever agree on anything, then it kind of becomes a little bit amazing to think about, well, this form of government we have actually works pretty well, because they do agree on, officials do agree on things. Believe it or not, they do agree on things. It's just not always as attractive to read or hear about those things they agree on as opposed to the things they disagree on. The disagreements are a whole lot more exciting to read about and watch. But they do, and it works. And it's just it's an interesting process. If you ever get a chance to spend any time in the Capitol, if you haven't, I would encourage you to do so. And when you go down there, if you've ever not been there and you go there for the first time, it's probably going to freak you out a little bit, because you're going to think, there is no organization at all of this place. This really doesn't make me feel good as a taxpayer. But believe me, there is an organizational, there's a method for the madness. Things get accomplished, good things get accomplished, and again, there are plenty of things to complain about. I'm sure from all of us when we watch government activities. But I think that there are good things that happen every year that I believe, at least over the past several years that I've been involved, I can always point to things that are examples of how the state has moved forward. The state's moved forward, and I think that's something I certainly would want to know with you all. As we talk about leadership and change, I've made a few notes here. I want to try to, some things I want to be sure and point out, and then I want to try to make sure we have plenty of time for some interactions, question and answer. I have found that my limit for listening to someone talk is probably about 20 minutes. And my best guess is that's probably maybe a little even above average these days. I'm going to say maybe 15 minutes might even be the average, because of our visual society that we live in now. You all are so used to seeing things on a screen that are pretty and move a lot. So anyway, I will try to be cognizant of that. Actually, my attention span has probably decreased over the last few years, I'll have to say. Maybe down to 5 minutes myself. So I'll try to be aware of that and try not to linger too much. When I talk about leadership, I never want to talk about leadership without using my example. And it's an easy example to me, but I've come to appreciate more and more the example of George Washington, the first president of the United States, and everything that he did to, I really believe, that set our country on a path that has allowed it to sustain as long as it has. And the one example that I always like to, that always means a lot to me, and this is actually captured in a picture, a painting in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol, and that is whenever George Washington handed over his military commission to the civil authorities. And out of all the great things he did, and I recently read a book, by the way, 1776 by David McCullough, that I would recommend you all read if you get a chance. It's a really good reading of the early days of the Revolution. And you see so many things that General Washington and then was going to be President Washington did that were great in the country. But the one that I single out, that I always like to focus on, is when he handed over his military commission to the civil authorities. And the reason that is so amazing to me is, first of all, that was never done, or I say never, seldom, maybe never, done in the history of mankind. Up until that point, the person who controlled the military was going to be the leader, or in many cases, the dictator of the country, whatever that country might be. And so that had always been the practice. If you had the guns and you had the weapons and the army, you were going to run the country. And so it's always been amazing to me to read about how General Washington did everything that he did. He went through all those years of fighting for the independence of the United States and defeating the British, and coming to the end of all that. His popularity was sky high. I have heard of accounts where people wanted to make him the king. He was so popular, and he basically said no to all that and handed over his commission and went back to being a farmer. And or went back to whatever his career was. I think farmer / surveyor. I guess he did a lot of things. But anytime I think of leadership, I can't help but think of that. And I always want to point that out as the example that means so much to me, and one that I really think if you could narrow it down and use yourself as an example, that's a great example, is President Washington. Leaders have to be decisive. Leaders have to have an understanding of the situation, be able to assess the situation. In many cases, have to be able to assess an enormous amount of information and variables and different points of view to be able to come to any kind of decision and purpose and direction. Leaders also have to be able to take criticism. In fact, I would say if you don't have the ability to take some criticism, you may not be in a position to be a leader, because you have to be able to at least take some criticism, and I think even be able to take it in a way that's constructive. Now, that doesn't mean that as a leader you always go a direction that somebody suggests that you should go. But I do think that, because if you did that, you would be going all over the place, and you wouldn't necessarily be a good leader in that regard. But if you can take those thoughts and those opinions and input that people can offer within your organization, or wherever you might be operating within, and use that to develop your direction, I think that's a constructive way to take opinion and even criticism in some ways. I was talking to Jerry when I came in, and I was talking about, as I was driving down, I was thinking about maybe some things to point out today that might be helpful in leadership today, and thinking about how leadership today and how it's what are some of the things that have affected how people lead these days. And I guess the first one that comes to my mind is just our technology and our ability to mass communicate. Kind of going back to the situation in the Middle East, I kind of doubt, and I'm sure somebody's going to study this after all this movement in the Middle East is complete. I kind of doubt that all this could have happened without your social media and your ability to marshal large groups of people to move in a direction. And that has been fascinating for me to watch, how that has, how I think anyway, that's affected the movement in the Middle East. My understanding is, based on a 60 Minutes episode, that whole movement for democracy started with one man in Tunisia. And I don't know if anybody's heard this story or not, but there was a street vendor in Tunisia who had his license taken away by a government official, a municipal official, and his vegetable cart, he was a vegetable or fruit cart, taken away, confiscated. And when he went to the municipal government to try to get his belongings back, they wouldn't allow him to have it. And I don't know the reason for the authorities not allowing him to have his stuff back, but he was so aggravated about the situation that he set himself on fire in protest in front of the municipal building there in Tunisia. And apparently and then he ended up subsequently dying after a period of time. That started a real movement in Tunisia that called on change in that government. And then it spread to Egypt and then to Libya, Syria, what you see today, Yemen. But it started apparently from this one street vendor. Along with, again, these mass groups of people, and probably mostly young people, probably your generation, communicating with one another and saying, we're not going to take the direction of our government anymore. We're going to change things. And I think that it's interesting to me to kind of look at that from a leadership standpoint, and how anyone who's in a leadership position is going to have to know how to use technology and know how to communicate with massive groups of people in their organization, to be able to communicate a clear message and make sure that they understand and communicate on their level. I was also telling Jerry earlier that my example there is one that my group. I'm at the tail end of the baby boom generation. I think baby boomers go to 64. I was born in 62, and so I've had I lag a little bit on the technological curve, and I'm really waiting for them to get to a point where they can't make any more advancements. So you guys will let me catch up because I'm quite a ways behind. But whenever I was in the speaker's office, I had a group of about 5 or 6 senior staff people who I worked really close with, and they all had, of course, Blackberries or something. I had a Blackberry, and as they would start a communication among themselves about an issue, and of course at the state level, most of the issues are pretty complicated, so there's a lot of dialogue that occurs, and I might be in a meeting with someone talking face to face, not being accessible to my BlackBerry for a while because that same staff told me to exercise good manners and not pull my BlackBerry out when I'm talking to people. So I try not to do that. But if I went without looking at it for an hour or so, they might have started a conversation where they had a whole long list of dialogue, and they could, as I told the group earlier, they could talk with their thumbs faster than I could talk. So it was a real challenge. It was a real challenge, and in that way, that is one of the things. If you're a leader, you've got to be able to use technology, obviously, and to be able to communicate with people. I think that also the way that it's going to affect leadership these days is, I think, with all the different forms of communication, the blogs, the Facebooks, the different sources and ability to communicate, I think is going to create, already has, and I think this will be probably somewhat of a new normal, is that you're going to have maybe a lot more skepticism within our populace. A lot more skepticism because if you think about the massive amounts of information that's accessible to everybody these days, and a lot of those sources of information some of them are based in perception and opinion. And I think a lot of that maybe it seems like to me anyway, that it's created a lot more skepticism toward leadership, certainly toward political leadership. I think that the politicians today, elected officials, not only in the Middle East, but I think in the United States, at the national level, at the state level, at the city level, I think are under a great, an increased amount of skepticism. And so that's a big challenge. That's a big challenge to overcome because, again, of technology. So changing thoughts here a little bit, moving on to change. Just a few notes here that I want to bring out. Change. I mentioned a little bit ago how what a big change we're seeing in the world right now with all the events that you see everywhere. The political unrest and volatility that we're seeing, I tend to think is probably going to be with us for some time. I think that is a part of what's changing in our world. And a lot of what's changing in our world is due to what I mentioned just previously, the ability to communicate, the ability to have access to so much information, and the way the governments are having to change with their finances and all the global recession that we're just emerging out of, and how that's created so much stress. That is creating a lot of political unrest and a lot of volatility, and I tend to think that's probably going to be with us for some time. Some of the notes to change over the past few years that I want to just touch on briefly. Let's see, now you all are probably 20, right? 20s. Around that age. So you don't remember whenever the Soviet Union fell. The wall came down, and Germany and the Soviet Union fell. That was a huge. That was a quantum shift in the world. That truly was. My age group grew up, in the Cold War era, and we were always fearful of what the Soviet Union. We just knew someday they were going to attack the United States. One of my favorite movies was the movie Red Dawn. Some of you, please shake your head, tell me you've seen Red Dawn.
Patrick Swayze.
Yeah, Patrick Swayze, that's right. Red Dawn, of course, was about the Soviet Union attacking the United States from Mexico, and how a lot of these were just everyday citizens who formed their own kind of militias to try to fight off the Soviet Union. Anyway, during my generation, we were always very, very fearful that the Soviet Union was going to take over our country someday. But whenever the Soviet Union collapsed, it was almost like one of those moments where you kind of pinched yourself and thought, wow, I didn't really ever think this would happen. And then to see the countries that emerged out of the former Soviet bloc and all the changes that came with that. The United States being clearly the superpower. I think without a Soviet presence around the world, I think you saw, it seems to me that and along with the U.S. intervention in Iraq, you saw a real strong rise in terrorism. All those things were big changes that we had to deal with. Another change to me that's interesting and noteworthy is the rise of other countries economically. Again, due to technology mainly. If you've ever read the book The World is Flat by Tom Friedman, and if you haven't, that's a book I would recommend. Because it really talks about, and of course the world is flat is suggesting that no country has a clear advantage anymore like they used to. And I guess the United States is probably the best example. Economically, we don't necessarily have the advantage we used to. The whole world used to totally depend on the United States. But as other countries have, in the case of China, they've accepted some market economics, incorporated some market economics into their economic system. As everybody practically in the world is exposed to technology and knowledge and information, you start seeing a flattening of the world, so to speak. And to me, to see the rise of these other countries has been big change over the last decade or two. In fact, even over the last 5 years, I think that we have really taken note in the United States as China rises. China becomes stronger in their economy, and some of the predictions I read about are that they will be the #1 economy in maybe 2020, maybe within the next decade. And so what all is that going to mean for the world? But that's all about change, and that's all about it's testing, testing our ability to be flexible, to make changes ourselves, to to adjust to these new forces in the world. And I think that it's been a tough adjustment for us in the United States. I happen to be one who probably feels a little bit anxious about what it means for the United States to have the kind of competition that we're experiencing with other countries now, economically. The rest of the world is not as dependent on the United States as it used to be, and so that creates some anxiety and creates some. I would hope, anyway, a pause for all of us to think about what do we do about that. I think it's easy to be reactionary and say, well, we'll just erect barriers politically and not trade with other countries, for example. That would be the easy thing to do. But I think we have an example where isolationism may not always be the best course. Because, again, the technology, the ability to communicate, has us interacted whether we like it or not. Has us interacted whether we like it or not in a way we've never seen before. Okay. I think I went by my time limit by several minutes. So let me just finish this way, and then we'll take question and answers. I do want to talk about, as we're talking about change in leadership and using my own experience and how I use that as Speaker of the House. I wanted to share with you just the platform that I thought was a platform that could help Oklahoma move forward. I thought these were issues that we at least needed to have public discussion about. And I looked at this really pretty simply. Whenever I took the office, I looked out there, and once I realized, I thought, well, okay, I've got this leadership position. Now I've got to provide some kind of vision or a platform. And I just simply asked myself a question. I said, what is it that Oklahoma needs to address to move forward in the future? And needed to find, in a political world, you got to have 3 or 4 points. So I had 4 points. And I labeled these all as challenges, energy being the first. I believe that our energy challenge is a big one. It's with us. We need to address our energy future in this country. And I think we have a great solution, and I may save some of this for maybe our discussion here in a moment. We have a great potential solution with natural gas in this country. We have an abundant supply of natural gas that we can use on our vehicles, and we can use to create electricity, but more specifically, the transportation piece of it can allow us to lower our dependence on foreign nations for our oil supply, which to me is long overdue, and a situation that we need to try to correct, because we have become increasingly dependent on foreign nations for our oil supply, and I don't think that's a good thing. I listed healthcare as the next challenge, and I don't think, unless you all have been living under a rock, you surely have heard there's been some discussion on healthcare over the last couple of years. And that is one those are the kind of issues that will drive policymakers mad, because there is a very wide gulf of opinions as to what we should do to address healthcare. And I won't get into all those details other than to say, from an Oklahoma standpoint, I felt like that we needed to have the ability to try to craft a solution that was good for Oklahomans. I felt like that Oklahomans could find a solution for Oklahoma health care. I was one that was reluctant and uncomfortable with an increasing involvement by the federal government. So we talked a lot about health care. Global competition was the third challenge. And when I came into the Speaker's office in 2008, we were seeing more and more signs of that competition that I mentioned just a moment ago. And I really felt like that as a state, I felt like that we were not really aware of how the world was changing so quickly. And just looking back 2 years hence, 3 years hence, I mean, you can see how much it's changed. I mean, it's changed dramatically just in these last few years. And it's going to continue to do so in the next few years. And I think that we need to be prepared to compete. And I think that we can, I believe the United States can still be a leader. I believe that with all my being. But we've got to be able to recognize the new climate that we're in. It is a new climate. It's a new normal. And then the last challenge that I would always talk about was our business climate and wanting to position Oklahoma to try to be a business-friendly state, a state that we could tell. I always like to say that in Oklahoma, we didn't think that profit was a bad word. And I thought that was a good way, at least in my simple mind, a way to communicate to people that what I was trying to say with that was, we're not going to punish you as a business if you'll come here and operate and be successful. We don't mind you making a profit, because we know when you're profitable, you hire people, you put Oklahomans to work. And in contrast to many states around the country, I felt like that are not necessarily open-armed to business. I wanted Oklahoma to be so. Those were the challenges that I had laid out and always talked about, and I think are still with us today for that matter. These are all 4 broad topics that are still, they need to be addressed, and they'll continue to be addressed in the future. And when you think about it from a leadership standpoint, you have to have the ability. I mean, try to imagine this. I'll close with this. Try to imagine this. If you were the leader, let's say you're the President of the United States, how would you try to approach the healthcare debate, knowing that you have such a wide variety of thoughts and opinions on how the system ought to look? And not only that, but you have a system that is a very complex system. I don't know if anybody in here works in the healthcare field or not. If you do, you already know what I'm talking about. But if you don't, try to sit down and understand our healthcare system. I mean, it is very complex. So with that, Jerry, I will close the opening remarks.
Thanks for being here today. I think what I'll do is I'm going to open it up for a few questions. And Laura, what's our time?
We have about 15 minutes for Q&A.
Okay, I think what I'll do is open up for some questions from some of the students and about some of your comments today and maybe their ideas on leadership. I like the question you posed about what's their answer on health care. They're going to have to deal with this here in just a few years. So let's open it up for questions from the class or audience here today. And if you'll identify yourself when you ask the question. Let's be brave. Yes, sir.
So you're not for universal health care, which is, I'd agree with you there, but what are some of the ideas? Like some people said maybe they should be drug tested or some if they want to receive it, or what are your thoughts?
More broadly, I think probably a first step would be to pass along the power to the states. We have I assume everybody knows what inflation is. It's the cost of goods, cost of life going up, cost of living. Medical inflation has historically, and I say historically over the last probably decade or two, has wildly outpaced your normal inflation. Healthcare inflation has been on the order of 10, 11, 12% a year on average, where your typical cost of living increases or inflation in the United States in the general economy is more like 2.5% to 3%. So you have what's happening is the healthcare spending is taking over a greater portion of our total output, our total GDP. And it's coming to a point where it's going to be unsustainable. Nobody's going to be able to afford health care. I would add, before I offer this at least first step, that I believe that the United States has I believe we have the best healthcare system in the world. And what I mean by that is quality-wise, I really believe that. I think we have a very, very good healthcare system. Our challenge is the financing of that system. And the reason it's a challenge is because think about all the advancements in technology you've seen over the last 2 decades. It seems like in the paper you read every day of a new procedure that's been finalized and can be used in medical treatment that's very cutting edge, but also very expensive. The kind of equipment that the medical community has to buy to do these things is very, very expensive. So, having said all that, move a lot more of the decisions to the state level. And from the federal level, the way the federal government could assist is that we already receive a lot of federal dollars in the form of Medicare for senior citizens and Medicaid, which is our more impoverished person, low-income assistance for medical care. The Medicaid piece is a partnership between the state and federal government. But what I would like to see, so we get a lot of money from the federal government for health care already. But I think what would be a good step would be there's something called a block grant. If you've never heard that term, a block grant, which is basically a block of money that would be given from the federal government to the state. It would probably be on the order of what we already receive today. Maybe build in a cost of an inflationary piece every year that would be more reasonable of 2 or 3 or 4%. Give the states flexibility to design systems that will fit that state's needs. I think that would be a great first step. I'll have to say I don't think that's necessarily a silver bullet. I don't know that fixes everything, if you will. I think something this big, you're always going to have challenges and problems. You're never going to have a perfect system. But I think if you could do that, I think that would be a good step. I would also add that medical information networking is another piece of the healthcare discussion that I think is probably you're going to hear more and more about. I know in our northeastern Oklahoma region, there is a group that's meeting actually to try to form a medical network where the doctors, all the providers, doctors, hospitals, communicate with one another. That's a problem we have in the system right now is the players in the system don't always communicate. And the reason you need that is because you have some people who are very mobile in their healthcare access points. They may go to emergency room here, A, one time, and then they'll show up in emergency room B another time. And what we have is we have a lot of duplicative costs that are built into the system because the system doesn't talk to one does not talk within. So that's another piece I think that would be helpful. Sir.
Chris, don't you think that we have somewhat of a double standard? I mean, we're eliminating personal accountability for our health. I mean, the state of Oklahoma sells those cigarettes and alcohol, like the pancakes at a festival, So you're promoting disease on one end, and then you've got your other hand out saying, well, let me come help you now. In other words, the reason we're in the situation we're in is we don't have a credibility or a standard that we want to live by today. It's like anything goes. Whatever the majority says, let's just go with it and see what happens. And if we don't like that, let's get another majority to make a decision. The reason we were so successful in the past is we had a standard that people were accountable for their lives. And today, the state of Oklahoma says, look, you don't have to be accountable, we'll come fix you. But we don't have the money for it. So that's, I think, really what our problem is. We need to promote education to tell our people that we are responsible for how we live our life. And it's not the state of Oklahoma that is our daddy. Or Roma.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, and it's one that you hear made a lot, at least in the government world, personal responsibility and the need to have more of that. It's kind of it's probably been a stronger argument over the last 2 decades. It's gone back that far. I would go back to the 80s probably as maybe the beginning of this recognition of what you're talking about, which is that the government is always there to provide all of our needs no matter how we live our lives. And the problem with that is that there's no value attached to that. For example, someone who, many anyway, who may receive care, free health care, for example, which we all know it's not really free, somebody pays for that. But if that individual does not pay for it, there's no real value attached to that. And you're naturally going to get a larger utilization as a result. So personal responsibility is a very good message, and one that we ought to be, as our kids are being educated, I think they ought to be cognizant of that. My solution would be, since I think you're closer to my generation, we need to have everyone watch episodes of Andy Griffith, black and white version.
Exactly.
How many times did you see Andy Griffith in dealing with Opie? He had a great moral to, that shaped the decisions of his son. I say that kiddingly, but I'm an Andy Griffith fan, so I always got to throw that in there when I can.
It's good philosophy.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Brent Huggins, you spoke to energy policy and specifically natural gas. Have you factored in the negative impact on the environment by way of hydrofracking? And what type of policies would you implement to prevent that?
Specific policies, I don't know of anything that could be implemented other than, at least in Oklahoma, what is already in place. I know that there are a lot of regulations. There are a lot of eyes, if you will, on oil and gas production these days. Even the industry even has the OERB, which they do a lot of their own self policing, if you will, on environmental issues. I watched a movie the other day called Tulsa. It's a 1950s movie with Susan Haywood, and it was about the oil strikes in the 20s. And a piece of that, and I thought this was interesting, because a piece of that was actually, they looked at the environmental damage at the time of the big oil strikes of those days, and it was kind of interesting to me to look at that to see how far we've come. We've come a long way when it comes to policing ourselves and being aware of the effects of oil and gas production in this country. Fracking, I think that debate is still fairly new. It's a fairly new debate because the fracking process has grown, of course, with your horizontal drilling and your shale production. So I think that you're in the early stages of those kind of debates. I tend to question the magnitude of the environmental damage that I hear a lot of folks talking about. Not to minimize that it's not something that we ought to be aware of and make sure we're not polluting our water sources. But I tend to think that some of that may be being used to slow down industry production. The flip side of it is, if you want to call it a flip side, or let me just say another element to think about, is if importing our foreign oil is a bad thing, and I think it's a bad thing, I don't think it's sustainable, especially from countries that we don't always have the best relationships with. If that's a bad thing and not a good thing, we have to turn to domestic resources. And if we're going to turn to domestic resources, we do have to be able to produce those at a level that can move our economy. So I think that there's also a cost-benefit analysis that has to be interjected into the conversation as to how much regulation are you going to put in place, because that regulation costs. It has a cost to it. Industry has to factor that in, and So then you get to the point of looking for some kind of balance on regulations. But you don't want to over-regulate, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
We'll follow up
Yeah.
if possible. Well, if you're saying that like foreign oil isn't sustainable, I mean, obviously natural gas isn't sustainable either. I mean, we'll exhaust that supply in so many years. So is that the most valid argument? I mean, versus looking at renewable energy sources or even utilizing, spending more money on education, and then we as a people creating sustainable energy sources through intellect and things like that.
Mhm.
I mean, to me, that seems like that would be more of a sustainable ideal than just going to natural gas for so many years and then being faced with the problem later.
I think if you listen to the natural gas discussion, your experts will say, and I'm going to use Boone Pickens as one of them, will say this is a bridge fuel. This is he recognizes that it's a finite source. It's a finite source. We only have so much. Now I will add that over the last 5 years we have found that our reserves are probably over 100-year reserves now, whereas just a few years ago it was more like 20 or 30. With the shale formations, we have expanded our natural gas reserves just exponentially. So, but I think even then, and some will even argue that there's even more out there to be discovered. And I tend to be in that category. I think there's more natural gas out there still to be discovered. But the point of your question about sustainability, and I think it's a good one, you have to look at natural gas as a finite source. Someday it runs out. So the hope is that we eventually get to a hydrogen economy. And that's kind of the big picture in all this, is to try to get to hydrogen, which is our most abundant element in the universe, that we can find a way to harness hydrogen and use it for our energy needs. We already have prototypes that they're not economical because it's way too expensive to implement, but we have hydrogen vehicles, for example. And the real, I can't say that I understand this completely, but the real deep thinkers believe that you can eventually, and you can take hydrogen from water, and then in a chemical reaction with oxygen, you can create an energy source. Think about how big that would be if we could extract our energy from water, because your byproduct is water. I mean, if you're going to use hydrogen to move something, the exhaust is water. So that's your sustainability. I will say on the renewable side, renewables today are a niche source. They're really not. We can't sustain this economy we have right now on renewables. So there has to be some development there to get to a point where we can continue to drive the economy the way we have.
Lord, do you have time? One more?
One more, and Trespassi cares.
Okay.
Thanks for being here today. I have a question. I wanted to turn your attention to Washington, D.C. As we sit here, the President is meeting with Speaker Boehner and also with Senate Majority Leader Reid. House is planning to pass and when we continue resolution, which would be the 7th one, and the Senate says it's a non-starter. So 2 questions for you. One is shutting down federal government a good thing or a bad thing for Oklahoma? And the second thing is, what are the leadership lessons that can be learned here about polarization?
It's hard for me to say that it's a good or a bad thing, and I'm not trying to give you a political answer. I mean, this is the way I look at it. I think, well, let me approach it this way. To the extent that we receive federal dollars within our systems, whether it be education or, we get grants at the municipal level, brownfield grants, for example, community block grant, development grants, a variety of federal dollars come to the state. To the extent some of those dry up, it's going to have an effect on Oklahoma, and it's going to have a negative effect on us immediately in a real short-term view. I have to say that this discussion and this argument that's occurring right now is about 10 to 15 years overdue. We have needed to get a handle on our fiscal house in Washington for many, many years, and we've just not really Well, we should say the exception would be during the mid-90s when the Clinton administration, along with Republican Congress, balanced a budget. So there is an exception there. I should point that out. But so let's say the discussion is 8 to 10 years overdue. The point is that what we're doing right now, in the direction we're going, the country will be bankrupt in not too distant future. We are, again, getting back to the competition piece that I talked about earlier. Our competition has a pile of cash, 3 trillion sovereign wealth that they are buying assets, and I'm talking about China. They're buying assets all around the world. We're charging for our stuff and then saying we'll pay it later. It's just not, you can't do that. And so the long term, if we have a government shutdown, it's probably going to, it's hard to say that it's helpful. I don't think I can say it's helpful, except that maybe it brings to point the argument and where we need to be and how we need to get everything together. The second part of your question was avoiding this.
What lessons can students learn about leadership and polarization?
Okay, yeah. I think the lessons to be learned are, we all have a set of principles. I think all of us do, that we probably operate under, core principles. There are some things that many of us, we just don't want to compromise on because it's a core principle. But in the realm of government and in the realm of, and the larger group that you represent, the more this applies. I mentioned a moment ago that at the state capitol we represent 3.6 million people. Well, at the federal capitol they represent 300 million. And of course you're going to have a wide view of opinions. I guess the lesson to be learned is that people need to, we all need to recognize that we have different points of view, and we need to respect that. I think that's the key. And we need to find a way to be able to come to consensus on very complicated matters, and in this case, in what you're asking about is a federal budget. And then I would add to that as well that there needs to be a more, I think, a practice of less self-serving, more mindful of the future generations. And I know that's said a lot, and I think most people mean that when they even say that, but I know it's harder to apply. But we really do. I mean, we are the richest nation in the world. We have grown up with things that nobody else has ever been able to experience. I mean, things like the conveniences that we have. And I just think that we need to be thinking about the future generations because we cannot sustain the level of spending, in this case, the level of spending that's going on in Washington. So somebody's going to have to actually, everybody's going to have to sacrifice long term to be able to get that back into equilibrium.
Well, I think it's obvious, Laura and Vice President Kenders and Vice President Kane, that we need to have Chris Benge come back and spend some more time with our students and our administration and our community. And I hope that we can arrange that maybe in the near future and have you back. So, Laura, any closing comments?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to be here.